I'm Chris Bussing. Welcome to my channel. It's committed to helping more people maximize their career path in tech sales. Let's just cut right to the chase. We've got a great guest today, Eric from Tech Sales with Eric. Great to have you, my friend. How you doing?
Good, man. Good to see you again.
Yeah, good to see you too. And we're going to dig into his story getting into tech sales and what people get wrong about a career in tech sales, how to maximize the career path, all that good stuff, a day in the life. So excited to dig into it. If you get value out of the video, make sure to subscribe because a little tired this morning. Hit the like button. That's my classic line because the algorithm actually loves that and will show the video to more people who can benefit from the message. And yes, subscribe as well. I don't know if you can hear my puppy. I'm just making noise. He's excited. But anyways, let's dive into it. Eric, thanks so much for joining. Can you talk a little bit about your story getting into tech sales?
Yeah, it's been kind of a roundabout journey, but I actually studied engineering in college, basically electrical with a focus on telecom. So I spent 3 years as an engineer. At the same time, I was actually an athlete. I used to be a goalie in the sport of team handball for the national team. And so I reached this point where I got a chance to actually play overseas. I wasn't too crazy about engineering. And in 2019, I ended up kind of hopping around Europe and a few other places, ultimately played in a world championship, and coming back to the workforce, knew that I wanted to go into tech sales. And then I'm sure we'll dive into it further, but I broke in at a kind of mid-size, high growth database company, an open source database company, had a lot of success there and just really enjoyed it. I think, and since then, kind of did that for 2 years before I started making any content. And honestly, kind of with my channel and part of what I do now, I felt, at least certainly at the time when I broke in, there wasn't a lot of content around really highly technical sales motions. I know it's something you have a lot of exposure to, and it's a lot of what you're doing as well, right? But that's kind of the shortest possible way to explain my background into tech sales. I'm happy to go further into depth. So
you're a true salesman because, you know, the great salespeople are succinct and to the point and allow folks to double click where they want to. And I'm certainly going to do that. So how did you, we don't have to get into the details, but like, how did you land on this open source database company? Was there a rhyme or reason, or it's like, okay, let me take the first great company? Like what was behind choosing that one?
Yeah, a couple different things. I actually looked at med device and tech sales pretty heavily. Going through both processes, I started to realize I had a few conversations with a couple different tech companies. I knew I wanted to go to a smaller company. And as I got into the med and tech interviews, I realized with my engineering background, I'd have a potential advantage against some of my peers, having that ability to go a little bit more technical. And so as I got into it, the company I actually ended up going to, part of the reason for me, my direct manager actually had somewhat of a similar path, like very similar. He had worked for 3 years as an engineer, actually took some time off as well, and then broke into sales himself. And so I had a couple offers I was considering, but that was actually a huge factor for me. I would get direct guidance from someone who had been on a very similar path. And I think that really helped me get some great fundamentals, especially year 1, year 2, kind of really ramping into tech sales.
So what's the difference between like a really technical sales role versus one that's not so technical? And I'm kind of thinking, within tech sales itself, couldn't you have like a role that's like a SaaS solution it's not too complex versus selling a database and like the infrastructure as a service and those back-end Legos? So could you talk through the differences between like a very technical sales role versus not?
Yeah, I think there's so many ways you can break it down. A lot of what comes to mind is certainly the types of personas you're speaking with. Highly technical engineers, really, I mean, social skills aside, right? The stereotypes of engineers, they're very, very busy and they're putting out fires at any given time. And they really don't have time to speak with someone who's not very knowledgeable and equipped. And so on one level, I think there's an element, again, a technical rep does not have to write code, but there is just a line, like if you are not willing to go and learn all about the technology, there's really not a way that you can foster a great conversation with an engineer. To your point on like the less technical solutions, it's not a better or worse thing, but in many times, if you're selling to an HR department, or even if you're selling to like a sales leader, those types of conversations and the skill sets required are just different than having to find and create technical value with someone who's been coding for 10 plus years, right? So there's so many more challenges I could get into, but that's what comes to mind. So
yeah, I mean, that's so insightful. And I interviewed another guy who was selling an HR software, and he was a founding SDR, and he said, "Hey, I just want to think about the path of least resistance. It's easy to talk to HR people; they love people or salespeople. So, but clearly, you chose a more challenging and engaging path. And I did too, with like Oracle database. It's funny, we were cut from a similar cloth, and then getting into, Google Cloud. But yeah, like with engineers as well, I think like, they're analytically minded. And so if you're a very, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud, but like I'm very passionate and emotional, and I have to like kind of manage myself and adapt like a chameleon to like mirror and match their style. So you have to keep that into account, right? Like you have to be able to speak their language.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So I wanted to ask you about the trade-offs between going into a customer engineering role or a more technical role in tech versus sales. Because some people reach out and ask me, and I know they ask you, should I do tech sales, or should I like be actually pursuing like learning to code and doing like an engineering type role?
Yeah. A couple things I would say, certainly, and I actually had a conversation with someone recently kind of about this, where I think there's a little bit of a misconception that if you don't have a technical background, you've never done even a coding boot camp or otherwise, getting to that customer engineering or sales engineering role is much more difficult. And it's not that it's impossible, but it's not so much an entry-level position like an SDR is. Like in my case specifically, I did maybe have the opportunity to go either way, given that, I had worked as an engineer for 3 years. And actually my first job for 2 years, I did a lot of like customer facing support for strategic accounts. So I had a lot of kind of that sales engineering type of exposure. For me, by the time I got done with engineering, just personally, I really didn't want anything to do with it. And I saw being in a direct sales role was kind of a new skill set. I had kind of the raw skills for, but would really push me to drive business and kind of think of things through a completely different lens. Whereas sales engineering, you're spending a lot more time in customer facing interactions, but you are still doing a lot of coding. You're installing for customers, you're writing, custom code specific to their solution, et cetera. So for me, it was just a personal decision like, hey, I'll go sales. If I don't like it, maybe I'll go to something else, but now's the time if I want to go directly into sales. So.
I love that approach. Like, just life really is an experiment. So why not try? Like, could this sales thing work for me? And clearly it did. Yeah. So yeah, I'm very curious. How did tech sales, this like career path, play into your personal vision for your life? I feel like there's got to be an emotional connection and a little meaning to what we do. And like, what does enable, for you? What did you see for yourself?
Yeah, I think, on a more personal level, it was a weird situation when I graduated, right? I had kind of fallen into playing team handball with the national team. And because it's an amateur sport, there's no like college eligibility limitations, right? Okay. And I got this job as an engineer. It made sense to go at the time. And immediately, probably 6 months in, I realized it wasn't going to be the long-term fit. But I was also kind of trapped by like, I had some student loans. It just didn't make sense to kind of play, which was what I really wanted to do. And so on one front, in my engineering role, I had never really heard about sales until I started working professionally. And I saw that there was unlimited upside financially, et cetera. That started to create an appeal there. But also, from a financial side, obviously the upside that sales brings is great. But for me, I like kind of on a deeply personal level, I hated that when I graduated college, I had to stop playing sport more or less because of my financial situation. Very fortunate for the opportunities that I had. But I see sales as a way. One, I do think, I grew up in a family of engineers. And so I didn't get a lot of exposure to entrepreneurship, to sales. But two, I think just on a personal level, it's, there were a couple of years there where I was paying off student loans. I didn't have the opportunity to really do what I wanted. And it's not so much in a selfish way, but I see sales as a tool to, yes, earn higher income in my day job, but also potentially earn entrepreneurial skills that if I need to go out on my own in the future, I'm more equipped to do so than just cold turkey quitting my engineering career. So, yeah.
Yeah, you hit it on the nail. And thank you for sharing, the personal reasons why. And sometimes it's, the greatest drivers are like a pain we experience. Yeah. Like, you mentioned that financial pain, and now, look at you killing it as a top performer. You haven't seen the thumbnail for this video, but it's got you. You're looking good, top performer. But anyways, yeah, similar for me. I saw an opportunity to use tech sales as a vehicle. One, it sounds deep, but for personal transformation, because it demands you build character. Like you have to get past your limiting beliefs when you're like getting rejected and doing cold calls. And so just, and like learning emotional intelligence and communication, and of course, business acumen, and now bleeding over into what you said of like business skills these skills and the connections are things we can take to start our own companies. And it's awesome. Like one of my mentors in Austin, which by the way, guys, Eric is in Austin with me and we got coffee, and he made me these coffee beans, which are amazing. They smell so good. One of my mentors who's also in Austin has founded 3 successful companies on boards, coaches, founders. He started in tech sales at NetSuite.
Oh, wow.
So just such a cool thing. But anyways, one thing I wanted to ask you about is, don't you think that like tech sales and like being an SDR, it lowers the barrier of entry into tech and is an access point, but then you can go into other roles, right? If you're successful as an SDR, can't you go into like an analyst role or other roles? Like what have you seen in terms of like career paths?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point. It's something that I think a lot of people that are trying to break in don't really embrace, right? Where if you go in as an SDR, maybe you have mediocre success, you have a lot of success, whatever it might be. To your point, opportunities open. And I think, you know, the short-sighted person that's trying to break in is like, I need to break in. I want to be a top performer. This has to work. I have to know. And like, you're not going to, right? But also, I've seen many cases where, as an example, you get a year into it and maybe you're not the #1 performing rep, but you've created, as an example, like some of the best performing emails, or, you know, you're working really well with different teams, and there's sales enablement managers that are reaching out to you, seeing if there's an interest to even maybe not transition to the role immediately, but start contributing to their deck, right? Or, you know, maybe in my case, if I came in and I was a mediocre performing SDR, because I have this engineering experience, you're going to get looks in other teams, other departments, et cetera. Like, hey, you're pretty good at sales and you have that engineering background. You know, would you want to work under this sales engineer for the next 6 months and transition to that role? So it's definitely possible. I think if you're putting in good work, you're going to get recognized by your peers. And also, don't be shy yourself. If maybe you get into an SDR role, like again, I mentioned I interviewed someone named Devin on my channel. He was an SDR, had a very clear vision of going to sales engineer, started to have success as an SDR, and leveraged that to have conversations with a sales engineering manager saying like, hey, I love this. I'm clearly very good at this, but I want to be a sales engineer. I've shown you that I can be good as an SDR. Like, what's it going to take over the next 12 months to make that transition? And he ultimately has, and is now a senior sales engineer as well. So just one example of many.
What a great insight, and thanks for the relevant story to illuminate what's possible. And you know, one of my SDRs at Oracle, she realized like she could get the job done, and she was smart. She actually got her MBA at Duke. Like, you know, like, wow, she's probably smarter than me. But anyways, she was highly relational, and I'm pretty relational too. She really hated dealing with rejection, and like that. Let's be real, guys. It's SDR role is not always glorious, and rejection is table stakes. But that's in life and in business too. But she did what she had to do well enough. And I was working with her, and she leveraged it to get into an analyst role. Yeah. And then because she had such an analytical mind, which is powerful. Like, I'm a super analyst, but also it can get in the way of our bias for action. You know, you're sitting there typing an email for 5 hours, which I actually could almost do that. So anyways, just another proof point, an example. But I wanted to shift the conversation now to another question of many questions that I still have for you. So guys, make sure to stay for the whole video because Eric's got a lot of value to drop here. But what do most people get wrong about tech sales?
Yeah, I think the perception has actually changed a lot over the last few years. And I think initially when I started, no one really knew what tech sales was or the nuances of like a highly technical sales motion, right? And you had videos here and there, maybe briefly talking about it, but credit to a lot of the creators like yourself and other people who have popped up, I think in the last, maybe say 3 to 4 years that, you know, all that to say, I think the biggest thing 3 to 4 years ago was like people would watch a Grant Cardone video and or just think that technical sales was like knowing the product and being able to rehearse like the top features. Like, we can scale, we can do this. Yeah. Like, and as you know, that's, you know, totally besides the point.
Yeah.
And now I think, honestly, it's been interesting. The further I get into it, curious your perspective as well. I find that aggressive maybe isn't the right word, but it's like people are approaching getting a tech sales job like maybe a different job where you submit an application, hope you get an interview, et cetera, as opposed to like treating it like a sales process itself, right?
Amen, dude.
Yeah. So
Yes.
there's so many things I could say, but yeah.
Yeah, no. I just totally relate because, as I think about the way when I work with people one-on-one in coach, and I know you've done some of that too, and have a great, training program, by the way, guys, to check out. We'll have to link that or give it a call to action or shout out at the end. But it is a sales cycle. When you're in the job hunt, you're managing multiple sales cycles. You're the product, the company is, the buyer, and you are exploring the mutual fit. Right? They need to be a fit for you as well, right? But a lot of it is being intentional and realizing not all opportunities are created equal as well. Like having priorities means one thing is not as important as the other, and not just getting any 60K job just to check the box, which you mentioned, but who are like the companies that where you're like, dang, this product's interesting. The culture looks great. They're actually going to set me up for success to maximize my career. And so, yes, like I feel like even in the sales territory this year, I've had a maniacal focus on who are my whales. These are the customers that are obviously they're financially healthy. They fit our ICP. I know that like the blood, sweat, and tears I'll put into winning the customer is going to be worth it because I'll put just as much effort into a small customer that actually might not be worth it. And so I feel like that carries over into the application process. Like give yourself credit and like pursue companies that you actually know are going to be worthwhile and that align to your vision. So anyways, just a thought there. And hopefully I'd love to spark some thoughts on your end on how the job hunt is actually like managing different sales cycles.
Yeah. Well, and I would add to that, I think one of the biggest thing that candidates discount is like past experience that can relate to a sales role and not having a cohesive story. Like candidly, I don't want to speak for everyone, but managers are pretty open-minded at the SDR level. Obviously, assuming you have some sort of track record, formal education maybe, or you went out on your own, you've worked retail sales, car sales, now you're trying to break into B2B sales. I think a lot of people discount the value of just having a very cohesive story. And like in my case, as an example, it's like even coming from the engineering world, like I mentioned, I had the athletic career as well. I had a lot of qualifications. And I had kind of the raw skills that work well for tech sales. And I'm sure people trying to break in have kind of that raw ambition, but I still had to craft a story as to like, I had an engineering job that I had done well for 3 years. I had been promoted, I had won awards, et cetera. I didn't want to do that. And why, I had to convince them almost like, why am I coming into this entry-level SDR position? And on the flip side, it's like, even if you don't feel qualified, I'm so much more intrigued if you show up, you've done research on the company, and you have a really compelling reason as to why you want to break into this role. I think people are so focused on having like a perfect answer as opposed to just trying to maybe calm down just a bit, create that authentic narrative and like be willing to accept the outcome. Maybe some companies are going to resonate with it, some companies won't. But I think people are really afraid to craft a great and compelling story as opposed to like, how should I say this? How should I say this? And it's kind of like, in a way, you're almost asking the wrong question, right?
Amen, dude. Like, I mean, we're cut from the same cloth. And telling a story, by the way, is, according to statistics, 7 times or more powerful than data and facts. So I'm not saying you have to go into crazy storytelling mode, but being able to answer the question of like, tell me about your resume, tell me about your background, and answer it through the lens of taking your special sauce, your unique experiences as a bartender. Yep. Or selling, one of the guys I was working with was selling season tickets to the Texan games. Well, there's relevant skills in there. Yep. Extracting the relevant qualities, like say maybe coachability, grittiness, proactiveness, ability to pick up the phone, and things like that, and translating them from that unique experience to what they look for in the role, showing what you bring to the table. Of course, then answering the question, why tech sales? And then why specifically that exact company within tech sales. So tell me your thoughts, but that's what I've been thinking lately is when you talk about your background, you have a chance to blend in a cohesive story, your unique experience and how you've developed and demonstrated the qualities relevant to the role, why tech sales, and then why that company specifically for the long term, because I think companies want to see you have a long-term interest. Yeah. So yeah, just thinking out loud, Eric, that's how I think about it. Is there anything you would add or adjust, based on that?
No, I would just add too, I think the precision that you think you need comes into play as you're going to an account executive role. like at that point, there's expectations if you're interviewing internally or otherwise that like you can demonstrate you can lead a sales cycle. Whereas I think a lot of people are trying to do that for the SDR position when, to your point, highlight the intangibles of coachability, highlight the fact that like you've done something impressive, whether you started a small side hustle or in your engineering job, you were a leader in certain KPIs or drove, significant results in one way, shape or form. So again, I'm sure without going down that rabbit hole, I hope that helps. And it's more, don't worry about being specific and being perfect at the SDR level. That comes as you start to work towards higher levels of AE. So
I think you put a perfect accent on that and it takes the pressure off. But if you show the qualities of coachability and passion, and the other thing I'm going to throw in that you hit on is intentionality. Like I am big on this, like be intentional in everything you do. You have a reason. Like, why did you start here? Why did you then make this move? And then in the process to highlight outcomes, because sales is an outcomes business. Speak the language of business outcomes. Like, here's why I did this. And while I was there, these are some of the results I produced. Hopefully there's dollar quantities attached to what you've done. And if not, that's okay. But here's how I stack ranked against my peers. But ultimately, having intentionality is key. Even if, like, say you were unemployed in the pandemic, like maybe you could show like, I took this time to educate myself and invest in this, and this is why I did it for a reason. And so I think that, they just want to see that there is intentionality to, what you're doing,
Absolutely. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about how to know if tech sales isn't for you, because it's not necessarily for everyone. I mentioned my SDR at Oracle who became an analyst, and if you're so highly relational and so terrified of rejection, that's going to be tough. If you're way too analytical, where you're paralyzed, that's going to be tough. These things can be managed and dealt with, because I actually naturally am relational and analytical. But are there some reasons why tech sales might not be for you, like sales in general?
Yeah, I would make an argument. It's a hard one to say one specific thing. I think on one front, many people, 60 to 80% of professionals, I think would really benefit from trying sales for a year. I'm not saying it's for everyone, but I think you would just see things and have a broader perspective when, even if you went back to a builder role or an analyst role, as an example, right? Like you have such a broader perspective on how the ins and outs work. I think it's a good skill to try. In terms of, when do you, when is it not for you? I think especially early on in your career, if you're someone that has, as an example, like, yes, a builder maybe, but someone who really likes to go very, very deep on many, like one or two things, as opposed to many different topics, that I think can be disheartening as an SDR when you're kind of changing threads so many times, right? Not only are you, having to deal with rejection, but you're working with this customer in e-commerce, and then you get a hold of a bank, and like you have to get just enough information to be like relevant, to make that a good exchange, to have like quality discovery, and then you've got to let it go, right? And I think all that to say, like, I think coming from the engineering world, I saw so many people that probably long-term wouldn't be a fit because they really liked going super deep. They really wanted to, tinker and explore at the lowest levels. And you don't really get that opportunity, maybe if ever, but certainly until you get to like strategic accounts, managing one or two accounts, something like that, way longer term in your career. So.
Yeah, that's really good to hit on then. If you want to go super deep, then maybe like a technical role could be a little better. So by the way, we've been getting great engagement from the live audience. Thank you guys. Appreciate it. Shout out to Sean. He said he subscribes to both of us. And he said, we're rock stars. You're the man. You're a rock star. And we've got Chef Capone, which I think is John. And he asked me to ask you how impactful it is to give a company you're interviewing a personal 30, 60, 90-day plan. And it's cool. I didn't know you made content on that, but I have myself too. So would love to hear your thoughts on that 30, 60, 90 in the process and how it helps you, stand out.
Yeah, I think in some cases, even, I changed companies last year, and I think having one prepared was a huge differentiator. Like I knew it was coming. In that case, they had kind of let me know that was part of the process. But I actually, when I was wrapping up a call, they were like, hey, we do want to touch base really quickly, maybe in the next 2 days. At that point, we'll go over your 30, 60, 90. I know I mentioned it, but if you want to, prepare it over the next 2 days, we'll sync up then. I had already done it, and I literally sent it to him live on the call. And it was a huge, very powerful point to have that done already. More broadly, as an SDR, a lot of times I actually don't see it being required. Maybe it's a good exercise to kind of think through how you're going to start maybe your first 3 months. It'll help you prepare for questions like what separates you from others, or, how are you going to be effective in this role? But yeah, I think I could go on and on, but I think in closing, like, yes, having it prepared is a good exercise. Obviously, if they ask it, get it done ahead of time. And if anything, like, the clarity of thought is more important than it being like this big extravagant production, right? Like, really just clearly walk them through step by step. Here's what makes sense the first month, second month, third month, and here's how I'm going to accomplish and measure that success. And it doesn't need to be more complicated than that.
You're exactly right. And one thing I think of with this plan is it's a way to sub-communicate. Like, damn, this person, Eric, Chris, is so committed to hitting the ground running. They're so intentional. Like, I feel confident we're making the right decision bringing them in. Yeah. And I just think going above and beyond when possible is really great. And some people might say it's a little too much, like, especially for an SDR role, but I'm kind of like, why not? And I have a little quote to share real quick that I happen to have, that I looked at the other day. It's by Lou Vickery. It says, 4 short words sum up what has lifted most successful individuals above the crowd: a little bit more. They did all that was expected of them and a little bit more. So, I feel like this is one of those examples. I've seen, this girl, Ren Hawthorne. I don't know if you've seen her on LinkedIn, but she got into tech sales in 2 weeks. And I interviewed her as someone who, she came from a background, I think she wrote music for Chris Brown, which is pretty cool. And she has like a life coaching certification. Yeah. So she's a pretty magnetic person, but she put together a cold call script as well for Zoom Info. So, it's not needed, right? But there are ways to go above and beyond. So,
and if I could add anything too, I think it's read the room, right? If you're going to a super large company, they have a very regimented process. I don't want to get pigeonholed or focused on one specific example, but maybe a 30, 60, 90 could almost be too much, like almost trying too hard, right? Whereas the flip side, maybe if you come to a high growth startup, obviously maybe they're not getting as many applicants as like a Google of the world, right? But if you show up in that final round and you have a 30, 60, 90 when it's unexpected, but you could tell based on your interactions up to that point that manager would appreciate that, now you're really in a position to blow them away. In the example you provided, maybe for Ren, the appropriate thing was a call script, right? And it really sets you apart. So I would just say there's no one answer. Really read the room and find the balance of being over prepared as opposed to, like, again, this is an extreme example, but being too desperate or like, please look at me, like I need this job, look at my 30, 60, 90. It's like, we don't care. Like, so
that is such a good point. Yeah. Because for me, my thing has always been go above and beyond, be extremely passionate. But on the flip side, you do need to read the room. And that's just naturally how I'm wired. And I noticed that with customers too. Like when I was at Oracle, I was dealing with Citizens Bank, a large enterprise bank company. And I remember when I was early on in my career, I was so excited and passionate. And the guy was just this older dude that was so analytical, was like basically settle down, So I think you hit on a game-changing insight right there, which is read the room. Yeah. So well done. So I've got a couple more questions for you, actually quite a few. And the next one is, how this might sound random, but it's important in this time. Like, how are tech layoffs impacting tech sales? These things are happening at big companies. A lot of the big companies like Google overhired, but how are layoffs impacting tech sales? How should we think about that?
Yeah, I think on a few fronts, it's really tough out there right now. Let's call it what it is. And the next 6 to 12 months are going to be pretty shaky. It's just an unfortunate reality. And I think it's just better to deal with it than, hope it doesn't impact you. I think at the entry level, oddly enough, throughout my time in tech sales, I've met a lot of SDRs. Some of them are making changes right now. I don't want to be overly optimistic, but I do think there's actually still a pretty heavy desire to get like newer and younger talent in the door. I do see a lot of like these larger tech companies, even that are going through layoffs, are still hiring for like entry to mid-level positions. And I think, call it what it is. I'm not here to say in no individual strategy, but I think candidly they're getting rid of some very expensive reps and they're taking chances on lower cost talent, maybe hiring, 3x the headcount as it used to cost for one, and seeing who pans out. And even if 33% succeed, it's still a win, So I do think at the entry and the mid-level, there's still lots of opportunity. And I would say, from an application standpoint, some of the things we've already talked about, really treating your interview process like a sales process or sales motion is the key. And I know a lot more people are in tune with this. A lot more people are doing this, but I think now, if anything, and I'll cut myself off here because again, I could go down the rabbit hole, but it really commands that, again, you have to have the mindset. It doesn't mean you're over eager or look desperate, but in every interaction that you have to have the mindset, like, what is going to prepare me to be the best candidate? Because in the past, people getting multiple offers, you could be in the top 5 and top 10, still have a chance of getting a job. Right now, companies know they have all the leverage and they're being selective and waiting until they know for sure that the person they're interviewing is the best candidate. So just take that approach into everything you do. Again, it doesn't mean you have to be desperate or try that much harder, but just really prepare yourself. What kinds of questions could they ask me? Practice your story out loud. Make sure your answers are very, concise, succinct, et cetera, et cetera. But I'll cut myself off there because that's one of many things I could get into.
Yeah, good point. Hiring companies have the leverage right now. And like you said, not that you need to be more desperate or put more pressure on yourself, but just be, again, intentional, do the research, put in the preparation, try and become an expert on their business and the product. Not that you have to be super technical, but at least the why customers might choose the product, the company you're applying to. And like you said, practice the questions. I love be succinct. It doesn't have to be the perfect words, but how you answer, with confidence and succinctness. Maybe throw in a nice story and tell it well. And what do you think about, we're kind of bleeding over to interviewing, but I always say come up with great questions, because our questions we ask often reflect our acumen more than, even our answers. But what are your thoughts on maybe, asking great questions, or are there any other components beyond just being able to answer questions really well that are important?
I think you're kind of hitting on the broader point, which is, I think someone breaking in you just think, let's take the example, you went to a 4-year university, you kind of been on that path, you study a lot to have the right answers on a test. And subconsciously, I think you take that mindset, like we talked about earlier, into an interview. And the point that I think we're hitting on is, it's the person getting hired right now is not the person that says the best answer. It's the person that I feel like, yes, there's an element of that. You definitely have to, answer things well. But if I'm taking a super polished person who is saying all the right things, but I question 6 to 12 months from now, if they're really going to be able to deal with the day-to-day of making 50 dials a day, getting hung up on all these different things. I think again, there's so many nuances, and I don't want to make it any more complicated than it needs to be, but shifting that mindset away from having the perfect answer to creating a very compelling story as to why 12 months from now, you're going to be the top performer in their department. And to your point, a great means or a great feature of that is asking great questions, whether it's related to, again, I tie a lot of questions into the story that you have. So as an example, in my case, hey, I have an engineering background. I've been a part of sales cycles from that engineering side, and I know the limits that technical knowledge has. What kind of training, or have you hired someone with an engineering background before? And what are some of the biggest hurdles they had to overcome? Because that's what I want to prioritize when I step into this role. And that's one example of many. And I don't even know that that's perfect. I'm just ripping it off the top of the head.
No, that's a great question.
Yeah. It's just tying in your story and really reiterating that desire authentically that you want to be a top performer, not just I'm going to do whatever it takes. I'm going to, knock down any wall. Right. So yeah, I hope that helps. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting too abstract, but
yeah, no, not at all, man. You've kept it really succinct. And I just think asking a question like that is very thoughtful. Obviously, it shows some of your credibility with your background, and it shows your proactiveness that you want to foresee obstacles and basically come up with a plan to overcome them. And another thing I think about is asking double-edged questions. One, you do research and you see that a company launched a new product, and hey, I'm really excited to see an article on this new Millennium solution. I just made that up, and it seems like it's solving XYZ challenges, and it's really going to position you well versus the competition. What are your thoughts on it? So it's you do research. One, you showed you did your homework. It shows you have an intelligent perspective on the company and where it's heading. You don't have to be an expert, right? But at least I think it just comes down to mostly I did some homework, and then you ask them a question and you get to obviously, anytime you ask a question and they share feedback, you actually build influence psychologically because they're giving you feedback and you get more ammo for future interviews. And so in a way, not to be, again, too nuanced or in the weeds, but I think those types of double-edged questions show your homework and your acumen. And also you get more info to bring with you further in the process. So.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So what is, we've danced around a lot of great topics. So I know, Eric, you're someone who could speak to it all when it comes to getting into tech sales and being successful. And so speaking of the latter, what is the ideal career path in tech sales? Loaded question, but feel free to dance around with the answer.
Yeah. Like I mentioned earlier, some of the things we talked about, I think if you've thought about trying sales for maybe 6 to 12 months, like I would really encourage you to do that. Because even like we talked about, if it doesn't work out, you're going to have a broader perspective. And I think people will appreciate that you tried it. Again, I'll stay on topic, but even if it doesn't work out, that story that you can create, the things that you abstract and learn from that experience are going to be very valuable. In terms of the individual path, itself, in my case, coming in as an SDR, I started a little bit later, having had that past career as an engineer. I was really laser focused on getting to an enterprise account executive role. And that was really, I think it just gave me more than anything, something to shoot for. But I can break it down in so many different ways. I think, especially if you're breaking in and you're pretty set on sales, at a minimum, I would strive to get to that SMB account executive role, maybe get 2 years in total, 1 year as an SDR, 1 year as an account executive. You'll have lots of options at that point if you're drawn more towards management of maybe an SMB team or towards pursuing that individual contributor path up the chain. For me at this time, I really love being an individual contributor. I see myself probably doing that for at least 2 to 3 more years before management. And then at that time, I may see and adjust my course accordingly. But, I'll end it with this. It's like every time growing up that I tried to plan everything down to a little detail, it usually backfired or I got there and I didn't enjoy it. So I've stopped trying to squeeze everything out of it. I think just having that goal of getting to the enterprise space as an individual contributor is a great starting point, and then use the data you have over the next 3 to 5 years to really inform the long-term path from there. So.
Yeah, getting that enterprise role is where you really start to make the big bucks too. I guess, when you look at RepView and other sites that have the median pay for different roles, man, it's a jump up. And that's where people you might have seen Brandon Fluharty, he's got a 7 steps to 7 figures, talks about how you actually make $1 million and up, and it's in those types of roles. So, and as an individual contributor, you never master sales. And that's why I'm still in the individual contributor role. I've been doing it for about 9 years, and for some people, that's just the path. And obviously you can go up to a key account director where you're managing Uber or General Electric, one account, and there's reps that align to you. But leadership's exciting, and it sounds like you want to go into leadership. Clearly you're leading through your channel, and that's a great path too. And another thing I think of is I love enablement and training. You mentioned that early on. And so that's a little different, isn't it, from being a manager? Because as a manager, you got to fire people. You're dealing with a lot of data. So there's actually some tough things that come with it. But a trainer, for me, it's hey, you could just inspire and encourage, tell stories and reinforce. But any thoughts on the, have you thought about the manager versus trainer?
Yeah, I definitely have. And I don't know the perfect answer. I haven't necessarily been approached to go to sales enablement nor sought it out myself. I could see that as a long-term destination. For me, as an individual contributor, I had a great start to my career and things have gone well. I don't know what it is. It's just more my gut. There's no specific formula I use to analyze this, but I feel like I have minimally a few more years as an individual contributor before I want to really start teaching a broader audience. Because to your point, I don't know that anyone ever masters sales.
Yeah.
But I think just getting more experience under your belt, you're that much more equipped to kind of pattern match or, recognize from a past really painful loss, how to handle something differently, whether it's you directly or coaching a rep through that. And, fortunately, I've largely had great managers, but I've definitely seen colleagues or otherwise that are getting advice from people who haven't been in the seat for any significant length of time. And I find that over time, the effectiveness as a manager maybe isn't there. So anyway, all that to say, I hope that answers the question. Maybe I got a little.
Yeah, no, totally. And I think that you have humility, that it's like, even though you've crushed it, I know you've been a top performer where you've been at, you realize there's always more to learn. And I realize that too. Like, I am no Sherpa on the hill, like that's coming down from the mountain with the answers. I'm just someone walking alongside people. I've been doing this now for, 9 years. That's a good amount of time, but dude, so much to learn. That mentor I mentioned that founded 3 companies that started at NetSuite, he told me a couple of weeks ago at coffee, he's like, yeah, you never master sales. He's like, I haven't mastered sales.
Yeah.
So that's what's fun about it. And I wanted to hit on another thing. Like, I love how you have a forward aim and goals, but you hold them loosely. Yeah. Because you never know, like, if you're so set on a fixed path and not rigid and not open, you might miss an incredible, unpredictable opportunity that's better than anything that our limited thinking could have dreamed up. Because our current goals are based on our past experience and our current thinking, but outside of that is unpredictable results. So for me, that looked like letting go of my vision to work at Google for the rest of my career. And I actually found this new opportunity at a Google partner that has been even better. And I just put out a video on it, put my heart into that video, and kind of illuminates trade-offs between big company and a startup. But man, it's exactly what you're saying. I had an openness. I let go of that attachment.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, dang, I'm sure like handball, like that. I mean, that's unbelievable that you got into that, and then tech sales, and who knows where the path will dance to. I'm sure if you're, a future CEO in the making. But that said, we've still got a little bit of time here. I wanted to ask you about a day in the life, and now there's a difference between a day in the life of an SDR and an account executive.
Yeah.
And I think at a high level, and I'm gonna turn it over to you in a second, that it's a grind with the SDR role. We have to acknowledge that, but it's the tuition we pay for more and more freedom as we move up the chain.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on the reality of the SDR role in the day-to-day?
I think coming in, it's interesting. I had a conversation. I know you mentioned Trent earlier. I had a conversation with him. We were kind of touching on that as well. I saw that. Yeah. Yeah. Like, I think early on, the first 6 to 12 months of your career, candidly, within reason, I think it serves you well to just have that mentality that you're going to run through a wall, and you'll be willing to spend 10 to 12 hours a day, not to, serve the company or be a suck up or anything like that. But I really do think if there's anything that set me up really well my first and second year in tech sales, it's that I was like a true student of the game. Yes, I was working a lot, but I was hyper focused. Those 9 to 5 hours, I was getting, 40, 50 dials in a day. I'm making sure I get through all the inbound leads first, and we can dissect that if you want to further. But I think especially that first year as an SDR, you can become a pretty good, maybe 80th percentile performer if you're hyper focused 9 to 5. And I think where the people you see that long-term really do well in sales, not only as an SDR, but later points in their career, is it, like I said, especially that first year as an example, when I'm at the time leaving the office and going home, I'm listening to sales podcasts. I'm buying, Challenger books. I'm buying Spin. I'm buying all these sales books. And even if I don't incorporate them necessarily into my repertoire, it's just broadening that perspective and really being a student of the game, trying to figure out what works for your relevant situation. Just getting those different perspectives really equips you to have a sophisticated game as you go up. So in terms of day in the life, I would recommend, I don't think the proper mentality is I'm going to work 14 hours a day in this job. I'm going to make 700 dials a day. I think the flip side is have a very focused day, learn how to be very effective with your time in the confines of maybe an 8 to 10 hour day. And then also, again, really being a student of the game, whether it's books, whether it's podcasts, whether it's people on LinkedIn, and also just, other reps, people in your network, make sure you're getting FaceTime with people that are where you want to be, while also honoring that 8 to 10 hours of your commando time. Like, no one's going to mess with this. I'm going to absolutely run through a wall for these 8 to 10 hours. So I hope that helps. Happy to get into it.
And embrace the suck,
Yeah.
The common denominator, take two. Gosh, the common denominator of success. It's a famous piece of sales literature by Albert Ian Gray. He said it's that successful people make a habit of consistently doing the uncomfortable things that failures aren't willing to do. They're willing to pick up the phone. They're willing to block off time and stick to it for prospecting. They're willing to put in a little preparation and plan to understand the ICP. Like, are we reaching out to the right types of customers? At least, I don't know about you, Eric, but even as an SDR, and this becomes more important as you move up the chain, but make sure you're the companies you're reaching out to are the types of customers that could afford your solution, that are a good fit, Like, what if you're reaching out to someone that has like no money and they couldn't even use your solution? And you learn to be more effective over time. But I think these are some of the things, man, just like leaning into that discomfort and putting the ego aside and being willing to commit to doing the work, it pays off. Because as I mentioned, the grind as an SDR is the tuition we pay for more freedom as you move up the chain in tech sales. And next thing you know, you're going to like, I'm hosting dinners in New York and jazz games out in Salt Lake City and fun events in Austin, Texas, which you're going to come to in the future this year. We're going to get together, have some customers out there. So, I just think the grind is totally worth it. And I had another thought on top of it that I thought was a golden nugget and I lost it. So,
No worries. No, I would just add too, I think like on that note, if especially that first year or two, you're really grinding it out in a good way, you'll reach a point where that is actually not sustainable. And you'll have enough experience now to really look back and say, okay, like to your point, you start to realize, oh, I shouldn't even be calling accounts like this. I'm wasting my time trying to target this persona. And you really reach that point where in a good way, because you put in that work, because you probably overworked and overstressed yourself, now you can look back and say, how can I get the same result with doing a very focused, 8 hours a day, right? As an example. And so just kind of bringing that full circle, like I think it's, you have to be willing to just get lost in the game for a while. And then from there, you get smarter and smarter because you put in the reps and because you're like, hey, this is not sustainable, right? So yeah. I think
and just to riff off that, and then we'll finish up with interviewing. And we got another question from Chief Keith. I don't know your actual name, but thank you for the question. That's a good name. But the beauty of sales is an outcomes business, and it comes with trade-offs, right? One is that you have to face the reality of your results and your outcomes, and you clearly are measured, and what failure and success is, and you're going to have to confront that failure if you don't hit your numbers, right? And there's pressure, right? You have to hit a certain quota, a set number of meetings, build a certain amount of pipeline. But the good news is if you can be efficient and deliver the outcomes, you can really free up your time if you're good at it. One of my mentors at Google, he was rep of the year, worked 20 hours a week, making deep six figures, and everyone knew it, but they couldn't argue with it because he got the result. My buddy, and I think I was texting you on this, I'm pretty impressed, right? I mentored him and he outshined the master because I've never done this. He made $800K this past year at 29. He was number one of 30,000 at Oracle Apps. And he said, Chris, I feel so bad. I'm working 20 hours a week. I'm taking 2-hour lunch breaks working out. I'm not doing this myself, Eric, but I'm just saying it kind of illuminates what's possible. If you can actually be super efficient. So anyways, Chief Keith has a question. And this is a good one, right? Now we're shifting to interviewing to wrap it up. What do companies want to hear when they ask, tell me about yourself?
Yeah, I think one of the things, a great exercise that I recommend people do is put 90 seconds on the clock and answer that question. And again, it comes back to what we were saying earlier. I don't want to say that there is one answer to that. I think it's tell me some cool things about your background, which again, even if, I worked with someone that worked in the restaurant industry and just broke into tech sales, and we worked together to highlight some of the things that they were able to do, from increasing number of orders. They had a huge impact on how many catering orders they did. And so all that to say, when you want to set the stage for someone to go into your experience further, but I think just a 90-second quick overview of highlighting some cool things you did. Like, hey, I worked at a restaurant, but one of the things that even caught my attention of sales in the first place is that I spent 3 months and actually increased our catering orders by 30% over that time, and then as I got into it, maybe I went to school for computer science or whatever, right? While I'm working this restaurant job, as I got exposure to tech, I realized and really just learned about tech sales that I loved some of the technical things that I was doing, but I knew for a fact I didn't want to be at the desk 9 to 5, 8 hours a day, just writing and banging out code, right? And so for me, and why we're here today is, learning the experience through technology of a very complex B2B tech sales cycle is, I think, the next logical thing for me. And it's really going to push me further than anything I've done to date or something like that, right? So I hope that helps. I'm using an example to
dude, it's so good. But, and that illuminates why it's great to invest in coaching with someone like yourself or doing a program, because someone like you and myself would help someone go through the process of translating their story
Yeah.
Clearly, like the way you frame that, like the individual you've worked with increased orders by a certain amount, and they drove. I think you said they drove catering business by an additional 30%, and you could quantify that, like the dollar impact, and just telling that story says quite a bit. And you know what? I love what you said about just highlighting interesting things. One client that I'm working with or that I'm mentoring, he started or basically took over a restaurant and created a food truck and opened up some catering and different categories for the business. And in his rebranding and like doing the marketing, he was so successful that Mark Wahlberg and his team reached out, and he ended up being featured in a Mark Wahlberg special.
Wow.
It's like that's a cool thing. The guy has no tech sales experience, but he has an entrepreneurial mindset. He did some amazing stuff. And so, like, I don't know, there's so many ways to translate past experience to sales, because the good news is we all innately have these qualities inside of ourselves,
And I think maybe giving a more direct answer to that question, is it's what I want to see as a manager. Like, tech sales is very hot right now, and we all have to start somewhere. But I'm sure you've seen it. I've seen it in my comments, et cetera. And I'm not criticizing these people. But when you come to me and say, I want to break into tech sales, where do I start? It's like, you clearly haven't done any research. And so all that to say, to the person who asked that question is, when you're coming to an interview, there's lots of people right now that want to break into tech sales. Give me a reason that's convincing that I can see you have a genuine interest in tech sales, as opposed to like your only motivation, watching some video of someone who said they made 200K last year and now a day later you want to do tech sales, right? Like, just create a compelling reason. It doesn't have to be overly complicated, but separate yourself from the pack. Like, wow, genuine interest. They've done a cool thing or two, even if it's, in a totally unrelated industry. Now, at a minimum, I get a sense you actually care. You actually want to be good at this, and you're not coming in thinking that you're going to make 100K in year one, right? So anyway, I digress.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I think one thing I'd walk through anyone who's looking to break into tech sales is take a step back and think about your personal vision for your life. And that's a question I often ask before hopping on, like I do these like free, consulting calls just to explore people's visions and why tech sales. And there's gotta be, like, when you get clarity on where you want to be, like maybe you want to get into entrepreneurship, you want to provide a great life for your family, and you want to do consistent trips. Some people want the flashy car. That's not the most important thing, right? Or they want to enable their, passion. Like, I started a YouTube channel thanks to, tech sales, providing capital for that. But where do you want to be and really have an emotional connection to it? And how does tech sales fit in? Because that emotional connection to that, to have it tying in tech sales to the vision, will compel you to do the things needed to be successful. And not just in the short term, but over the long run. And that'll compel you to want to do the research. And you're right, man, you got to have the curiosity and take initiative. Like salespeople do that, or in entrepreneurs, is start researching. Like, you're absolutely right. No one should come to a first conversation like with no idea about like how to break. They should have done some degree of research. And so anyways, I'm getting all fired up, but when tying it back to interviewing, what type of research should someone bring to the table even before the first recruiter call? Like, and I'll throw a few things out, like, this, but like, obviously understanding the product and where it fits in the market, like just at a high level, like, who is the leadership? What's the direction? Like, what are the culture? Like, what do you think about research? Like, what should people be looking up?
Yeah, again, something, there's no one answer. You hit on a couple different things, and that's what I recommend. At a minimum, do 15, 20 minutes of research before even the first round interview, especially right now, candidly, as competitive as it is, maybe even more, maybe 32 an hour. I think the big thing, for me is, to your point, it's what's your angle, right? Like, you create that story of why you want to get into tech sales that's differentiated from just some fake idea of making money, right? And then now from there, is it the leadership team? Is it the renowned sales training program and brand of Oracle? Is it something specific about the tech that's really well differentiated from its competitors? There's no one answer. In an ideal world, maybe you can answer a 15-second blurb about each of those, but at a minimum, showing up to one. You create that story of why you want to break into tech sales. And candidly, like, based on my computer science experience, I've really wanted to go into this database space. Whatever database company, what really intrigued me about you is how well differentiated you are from this, or I really love the training that you've had. I noticed your CRO started here as an SDR, as an example, right? Like something like that. These are the types of threads you can pull that really show a lot of interest, with also not being like desperate, like your company's the greatest. I've done so much research. I love what you guys do. It's like you have just really succinct and concise reasons why. So hope that helps.
That's gold, man. Like those are great examples. Like you saw literally that their leader started from the bottom and got to the top. You saw it like hit on a specific differentiator. Like that's a double-edged sword. It really it shows your acumen and you did your homework, and it opens up a conversation. Absolutely. So yeah, I wanted to ask you a little more about interviewing as we wrap up. We got a handful of minutes left, So what are the most common types of questions that we're going to need to prepare for in interviews for the SDR role beyond, tell me about yourself and telling a cohesive story?
Yeah, I think at the SDR level, there's really 3 questions you should prepare yourself for, which is like, tell me about yourself, why tech sales, and why this company. That certainly at the recruiting level is the first round, kind of screening call is what you're really going to need to prepare for. And from there, it's just building on that story with the SDR manager as an example. Like, for instance, and cut me off if I get too deep, right? But those 3 questions will prepare you to do well in the recruiter interview. As the recruiter gives you the thumbs up, tells the sales manager why they're passing you through. Now you still want to be prepared to answer those questions, and they're going to ask you so you can say it to them specifically. But now it becomes more of a dialogue and kind of question and answer, and really controlling the conversation. Like the SDR manager is going to be the one that has answers about the tech, or the SDR manager is the one that's going to be more equipped to tell you about their training program and what it looks like from 0 to 6 months into the job, right? And so if you're coming in prepared to in the SDR manager interview or the second round to really have those have those questions ready, but foster that conversation around the opportunity at hand. What are, towards the end of the interview, what are things, if you've hired an engineer before, what do you expect I should overcome? Tell me more about like some of the biggest success stories and failures of your training program. That's one of the biggest reasons I'm attracted to your company in the first place, right? So I could go on and on, but I think it shifts over time from being very transactional at that first round to really still being prepared with all that information, but also being prepared to drive a conversation around the technology, about the program, about the company you're interviewing with as you go further down that funnel.
Yes, exactly. And you know what? I only have maybe 1 or 2 more questions, maybe 2. But when we look at interviewing, also you'll get some behavioral and role related questions. Like obviously a lot of these programs, like I know Dell in particular, and startups, like anyone is looking for coachability. So like you might get a question, tell me about a time you received a piece of feedback and how you implemented it, or something along those lines. Or tell me about a time you failed. I remember, this is for my interview at Google, and it was for an inside sales role. So I don't know if you get this in an SDR role, but tell me about a time you disagreed with someone and had to, change their mind, or you resolved a conflict. But are there any in terms of behavioral questions beyond some of those that I'm mentioning, you absolutely got to prepare? Because I know there's a lot of flavors and we could open up a can of worms, but
yeah, no, you bring up a great point. And I think it's definitely worth calling out some common ones there, because you will see that. And I would say 50+% of SDR interviews in the later stages. And certainly as an account executive, you're going to get those all the time. I think to your point, a time you received harsh feedback is a very common question. A time you disagreed with a colleague. Tell me about a time. I had a good question actually when I interviewed this past year at a couple places. It was, tell me about a time when you achieved your peers, which was an interesting one because I'd never been asked a question that kind of point blank. And who's to say what they were looking for? It went well, but it's an interesting question because you have to be willing to kind of vouch for yourself without also being like, yeah, everyone else sucked, I'm so great.
Yeah, so, no, you're so right. You're so right, by the way. You have to find a way of showing confidence and being your own advocate from a place of also balancing it out with humility. So, okay, I know we're coming up on time, but I just want to squeeze in a few more things. We even got another question, but from BMC, which I don't know if it's a nickname, but anyways, for like role related questions, like Google had this, right? They're pretty intense. Like you have cognitive ability, like problem solving, consulting questions, just high level, but that's not typical. But like role related questions are common. So I actually got this at Oracle for my SDR role, and this is over 9 years ago. You're given a list of accounts, some greenfield, some install, meaning they don't buy from you, and some current customers. How do you prioritize and like, what do you do to reach out, right? Or like you might, so all I'm saying, we don't really have time to dig into it, is you could, right, get questions like that. Or like, how would you do a cold call, like walk through a cold call script? So more so maybe just like throwing out some of the high level questions you might get in like that are role specific. And these are more advanced, of course.
Sure.
But yeah.
No, I think you bring up a great point. I think the inclination and a lot of those questions, when you get to these more complex questions that are hypotheticals, let's use the one of you get a territory, right? You get a territory, it's 50% existing users that you want to grow. It's 50% greenfield accounts. How do you plan your territory? I think the amateur is going to feel the need to answer that right away. Whereas I actually think within reason, management would appreciate clarifying questions, right? Like, okay, so you have existing users. What products are they using? Like in the case of an Oracle, right? Oracle has tons of different products.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, right? So like, what is the typical user that I'm inheriting? Are they using this product? Are we typically seeing growth patterns by growing seats there? Is that an easy motion? Are we seeing trends that if they're using this product that all 50 of my accounts have, is there a logical upsell with a different vertical or a different product that makes a lot of sense once they've onboarded with this initial technology? These are the types of clarification questions you can ask, and then with a more educated viewpoint, come in and say, well, hey, here's how I'm thinking about it, right? Greenfield, as we know, pure outbound is typically the most difficult. And I'm not going to neglect that by any means, but given, we have users that we typically see 25% year over year growth with this core product that they've already bought. That's where I'm going to start right away. I want to make a point in month one, or as soon as I'm onboarded with the training, to go after all these accounts and make sure we've identified any low-hanging fruit and opportunities for growth, right? From there, if I'm transitioning, and there's even more within that
that's so good. That's exactly it, by the way. I would start with the people who are more likely to buy from you who are already spent with you. And ideally though, you find someone who spends a little bit and there's a lot of wallet share left, meaning they spend a lot more with the competition. And so, to your point, and of course the greenfields though, they're a lot of work and there's a huge upside, but continue on. I totally agree.
And I would just reiterate too, but specific answer aside, the important thing here is that it is totally okay to ask clarification questions. Like they're going to appreciate the fact that you don't just take things at face value and you really want to understand the entire context before you just say, oh, here's what I do. This works all the time. This is the easiest path to success I found. It's like, if you clarify and you're actually working with the real world, they're going to really appreciate that. And by extension, maybe I won't get too caught up in the outbound example, but ways, it's like, hey, I've exhausted the low hanging fruit. Obviously there's a lot of things within that, we can attack and that makes sense to go after first. Now, as I go to outbound, what are some of the most common success plays we see? Are we a great fit to displace a legacy and more competitive vendor? Because if so, I'm going to try and take these 50 accounts and figure out which ones map to that play, that takeout really easily. I'm also going to see if anyone in these greenfield accounts, I'm going to look in our CRM, see if any of them are downloading educational white papers, see if they're looking or attending any of our webinars. And if so, and that's been within the last 3 months, I'm going to really make a point to prioritize those and see if there's still interest, see if there's a real need for them to explore it further and attack it that way, right? And again, I could go further and further, but asking those clarification questions, even if you're wrong to a manager and maybe they say, well, I see what you're saying, I would potentially do it this way, but I'm not mad with your answer because how would you know that? I've been here for 3 years and you're interviewing with us, right? And so I think just showing them that you can ask these questions, that you can quickly come up with a well-informed viewpoint and minimally you'll execute on this and learn quickly is the most important thing. And I hope through like that in of itself is such a TED Talky thing, but I hope that example actually kind of highlights what that looks like in real time, right? So, yeah.
Thank you for joining Eric's TED Talk, everyone. No, anyway, what you shared is great news for all of us. This is a truth, a principle in sales. You do not need to be the smartest person in the room. In fact, that could hurt you because the minute you think you know it all, you cut off your potential. You need to be the most curious. So the way you answer that question, you hit on the most important component, is you don't need to know the answers, but you need to be curious and take the time to ask qualifying questions of the hiring manager, and they will really appreciate that. Tying it back to Google with those crazy cognitive ability questions, like they literally asked me, there's a dying newspaper company or a private equity firm, buy it out, what do you do? They actually wanted to see my ability to tie it into digital transformation, right? Which is relevant to my role. But the thing you do in those cognitive ability and interviewing questions that I was taught, because I'd talked to some Googlers before joining, is you do ask clarifying questions. You limit the scope of the problem. Dude, it's exactly what you're saying. Yeah. So that is totally best practice. And with customers, the thing is by you showing your curiosity and not diving into an answer, they know that with customers, you're not going to make the grave mistake of pitching too early or diving into an answer. So you're actually going to be curious and ask qualifying questions with them.
Absolutely.
So I've got one other question. Okay, we actually have, I know we went over time. We've got two other questions from the audience. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't have a hard stop. I mean, we'll wrap up shortly. So BMC, I finally get your question. Thanks for it. Is that how do you answer? I love this one. The sell me this pen, or will sell me this question. But of course, I could ask sell me this pen. So let's riff on it.
Well, I'm going to be a bit contrarian and say that I don't like that analogy in the context of B2B tech sales. There's never a situation. I've maybe been asked by one CTO kind of sarcastically, like, hey, sell me your solution, right? Tell me why I should buy this. But by the time I had that conversation with them, I had already had 3 calls with their senior solutions architect, and I could relate their specific context to that problem. So we could definitely go through the exercise, and I apologize if that's not the answer you wanted to hear, but just a vanilla, sell me this pen. There's so many things, do we discover how they use pens, how often they use pens, what type of pen they want? There's so many ways you could take it that I apologize, BMC, but I'm going to reject that premise. So,
well, I would say you answered it. And BMC, the only thing I would add, basically expanding on what Eric's saying, is you're not going to get a lot of like crazy curveball questions. You might get those, sell me this book or whatever. Don't freak out, pause, and just ask questions to understand, like, if they have, how they would use whatever, if it's a pen, like how do you typically use a pen? Have you bought a pen before? Like, how much have you invested? Just getting a sense of their actually whether they have a need for a pen or not and how they would use it, and then tying it back to that. Because you also, part of this exercise is disqualifying. What if they're not a good fit for buying a pen? Like, they're not actually really in the market. They don't need it. So that's super high level. But I know Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street, you can look on YouTube when he does sell me this pen, and it can apply to many types of things. It's basically take a pause and like kind of evaluate if they actually have a need at the highest level. So if you do that, you will actually, you don't have to be perfect. Eric, you hit on that point, man. It's like, we don't have to be perfect, especially for an SDR. They just want to see how you think in your process. All you have to do basically is not pitch at them. I think it's that, like, don't pitch like, oh, you should buy it because this, like, ask some questions to qualify.
Yeah. And it's like, even in that example, when that CTO asked me, on our 3rd call, hey, sell me your solution. Why should I do this? And it's like, well, hey, candidly, I want to clarify in your own words that my understanding of what you're doing right now is correct. And like, even setting that baseline, to your point, like we've talked about before, going into why they should adopt it, is it's like having them articulate that, diving into, their current state. I could go on and on. I'll cut myself off, but right, like, what happens if they don't move to us? And if you can pull that information out and extract that, then you have the leverage to quote unquote sell something. But ideally, in a way, you've almost made it self-evident. So
yes. And so one thing I'll riff off with that is when I started at Oracle, the foundation of the training, like you said, they are renowned for their training, is the Sandler sales methodology. It's rooted in transactional analysis. And they talk about the negative reverse, but like what I'll say, I'm not even sure, is like a little technique. And by the way, not that sales is all about these little techniques, right? Ultimately, you want to be a good human, have integrity, and operate, authentically and be curious. But there's a way to pull back, right? In these moments when the customer pressures you, like, wait a second. Like, I don't even know if there's a fit for the solution, actually. Like, I don't understand anything about your current state and your goals and your needs. So if you could help me understand that, maybe we could figure that out. Like, and maybe that's a little bold and brash, but you have to figure out your own style. But if anything, it can be, if a customer's pressuring you, like why you, like, take a step back. Like, I think they can like understand that, like, without you understanding their needs, you can't really sell the solution. However, one thing I'll add, I'm going on a tangent, and I'll cut myself off, Eric, is yes, you could do your research to find a very relevant case study in the exact industry at a similar customer size, if you have that available, and you could like intelligently speak to like this similar company like you solved these problems. Yes, if you have that in your back pocket, cool. So that's one thing. But anyways, final question we got from Chuck. Thank you, Chuck. Way to be engaged. I appreciate it, man. And then we'll finish up, Eric, with some calls to action. I want people to be able to follow you, and sure. A lot of them probably already are. Chief Keef said, "Who let the dogs out?" Good question. So which is better for a new SDR? Final question: a startup with minimal training, or a major company with extensive training?
Yep. No perfect answer here. Here's how I would break it down. If you are fresh out of school, you are rather young, early 20s, maybe even late teens now. I know, some people are breaking in. I think the best thing you can do, even if you end up not liking it, is to go to a big brand. If you're able to get, like in your case, you get an offer at an Oracle of the world fresh out of college, that is a great move because one, to your point, you get the Sandler training, you get the brand recognition. There's a lot of people who have been successful at Oracle, started other companies or become top reps there or elsewhere. And then from there, if you don't like that super large corporate setting, a lot of startups that are growing fast, in maybe a database startup as an example, would love to have you join their company. The flip side, I think in my case, I joined a startup because I had actually in the engineering world worked at a super large corporation. And later in your career, I would argue it gets harder and harder to go to a startup because it usually demands more of you from a day-to-day. So for me, not that I saw it as like the last chance ever, but like I mentioned, I broke in as an SDR when I was like in my late 20s. And for me, it was kind of like, well, at this point, I've worked at a huge company. Let me go to a startup, see what it's about. And if I need to, I can work my way up to a bigger and bigger brand. And that's kind of how my path has gone since then. So I hope that helps. There's no perfect answer, but just reiterating, if you're young, if you get an offer from a brand name, just do it. You may not like it, but you have more options out of the gate because of that badge on the resume. So
yeah, dude, 100% right. And there's no silver bullet. I hope people are getting that in sales and in life. Like, oh, what's the perfect cold call script? Like one might actually work a little better, like one flavor versus another. Like should I say, this and this, how do I answer this? Where do I start? You do have to take into account your personal goals as well. But I will say, and just finishing up, like with my personal experience, starting at Oracle, exactly for the reason you said, Eric, was an incredible move. Like you get great training, then Google recruits from Oracle because they know they're like pre-trained sales talent. Like other companies recruit from Oracle. So you set yourself up, right? It's a bigger company. It's not perfect, but you get, great training and enablement. Now a startup though, now having been at a startup is exciting. Yep. It's super exciting. And it's actually to me, the most rewarding because you get to really shape the culture, your deals, every deal you close has a huge impact. You get accessibility to leadership. But what I've seen in working with some mentors or mentees and clients is that when we go to a startup and they're a unicorn and they're bringing on founding SDRs, like they expect them to be really freaking good and really autonomous and to know what they're doing. And so you're not going to get the same training, and there's going to be like, there's a huge upside and you get to make an impact and it's a fun environment. But it's not like an enterprise where they can afford to bring in someone with like absolutely no experience and train you up, if that makes sense. Absolutely. So it actually might be, I think, Eric, like a lower barrier to entry with no experience to get into a larger company. Not always the case.
Yeah. Yeah, it totally depends. I'm sure there's so many cases we could dive into. So yeah.
Yeah, but man, what a conversation. We dove into so many nooks and crannies of tech sales, how to get in, how to be successful, how to interview well. Eric, thank you so much. This is one of my favorite conversations on the channel. And let's finish up with some calls to action. I'll steal some of your thunder. Guys, check out, if you haven't already, Tech Sales with Eric, and subscribe. You know, I'm about to hit that subscribe button myself. I'm surprised I'm not already subscribed.
I was gonna say, I'm mad you haven't already, man.
Yeah. So I'm going to do it. Okay. So I encourage you guys to do the same. I really enjoy his videos. And also, I know you have, like, you know, some coaching and some training and a program. Any other like resources that you have available or ways to connect with you?
Yeah, no, definitely appreciate you having me on. And yeah, like Chris mentioned, channel, I put it in my name here, Tech Sales with Eric. In terms of programs, you know, I have typically worked with a lot of folks that have maybe 5 to 10 years of experience, don't necessarily have a degree, or folks that do have a college degree, maybe a STEM background or otherwise, and are looking to break into tech sales. So I have a dedicated program for that. You can find that in the description of any of my videos. And also, if you're in a position where maybe you're looking for a college alternative, I know you've spoken with Troy. I'm a partner with CourseCareers, and I think they provide a great path for those that maybe don't want to go the 4-year degree route or are looking for another great option as well. So no answer, and whatever kind of fits your background and where you want to go.
Yeah, I know CourseCareers is great. And for those of you that have like the experience and the appetite, you know, check out, you know, the opportunity to work with Eric more closely. Man, he's a beast, and he's living the thing too. That's the cool thing. He's actually in the trenches doing the job. But yeah, you know, Eric, we'll have to get out to Cancun to see Troy from CourseCareers. I love what he's doing. And just, yeah, for anyone who's thinking about college or an alternative to college, like, you can pay a lot of money, and I certainly did, to go to a top university, and it did pay off. But imagine you get paid to get the ultimate real world education, to learn sales and communication, all these things, and actually build a network. You get paid to do it. So if that's something you're interested in, you know, it's good to check out, and CourseCareers can help you on that journey. Eric, thank you so much. I don't think this is the last conversation we're going to have together. But also, guys, you know, thank you to the audience for showing up. I think we had up to 11 plus people at one time, and we have 10 on currently. Really appreciate you guys. To your success in tech sales and in life. Happy selling and happy living, and we'll see you in the next one.
All right. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, thanks.